Welcome back. This is lecture 20. We're now moving on from early medieval to the era of the Carolingian and Ottonian. So Carolingian, roughly 760 to 870-ish. Ottonian, the early 900s through the early 1000s. So we're about 1,000 years in the past now. We're getting closer and closer to the Renaissance, which begins about the year 1400. So the Carolingian gets its name from powerful leader Charlemagne, or Charles. So Charles, or Charlemagne, is a very, very powerful leader who will become crowned the emperor of what is now called the Holy Roman Empire. So it's a kind of fascinating story. What you're seeing here is the Carolingian Empire at its height. You see the expansion of that territory, which includes Rome here, most of what we call Lombardy, including Venice, Florence, and of course what is now modern-day France and Germany. So it is the majority of Western Europe unified under a single ruler. The successors to Charlemagne will lose territory, although they will still have some influence over France and Burgundy and Lombardy. Their territory will reduce somewhat to be primarily German. So you can think Germany. You can think of these people as Germanic tribesmen, primarily the people known as the Franks. And these are the tribal leaders who have united with the Pope in Rome to maintain some control over the territories that had at one time been part of the Roman Empire, but following the sack of Rome and the chaos that follows that period, you can imagine that a lot of different leaders are vying for power. So when Charles is able to establish his support for the Pope, that then gives him not only political power, but also an enormous amount of religious power. And so the Pope reciprocates Charles's support, or Charlemagne's support, by giving him this title of Holy Roman Emperor, which then implies that the western half of the Roman Empire continues into the Middle Ages under the auspices of Charles and his successors. Of course, not exactly that unified, and it doesn't last for an enormous period of time, but you can imagine that at one point Charlemagne becomes the closest thing we've had to a true successor to the Roman Empire. It definitely has an impact on art making throughout Western Europe. So Charlemagne, who is crowned literally Christmas Day, the year 800, by Pope Leo III, is the de facto leader. And this image that we're seeing is probably either Charlemagne or his successor. So we don't know for sure that this really is what Charlemagne looked like. It may in fact be a portrait of Charles the Bald, who is a successor to Charlemagne. But in either case, it is quite obvious that we're looking at the inheritor of the equestrian style that we saw in the portrait of Marcus Aurelius, the difference being scale. Marcus Aurelius' statue is well over 11 feet in height, and this piece is not even 11 inches in height. We do still see the distortion of the size of the emperor versus the size of the horse, and we can clearly see a reduction in the accuracy of the anatomy that's being depicted. So you have to think that although there is a massive influence on the art of the Carolingian era from its ties to Rome, we are still in a territory in Western Europe that is a fair distance from the art-making centers of the Roman Empire. And so we are seeing sort of the translation of, or the inheriting of, artistic ideas that are not necessarily native to this territory. And we can certainly see that what is happening in Carolingian art is really less of an emphasis on accuracy in depiction and more of an emphasis on symbology. So think about Charlemagne really intentionally trying to model the art styles that he is supporting on the art style of Constantine, the last emperor to sustain control of the vast territory of the Roman Empire. Remember, the artwork that we saw under Constantine was more simplistic and more symbolic. We saw figures that were repeated in a way that made them look less like individual and more symbolic types. We saw representations that emphasized people's power, such as making the king the largest physical size, right? That hierarchy of scale is going to continue here in Carolingian art as well. We definitely see in the Carolingian style some of the same things that we saw in the insular styles when we were looking at the early Hiberno-Saxon art in the previous lecture. So you can see here, this is Christ enthroned. This is a lectionary book, and you can see that there is an emphasis on symbolism over representational reality. I mean, the way that the drapery folds around the knees is completely unrelated to accuracy in terms of anatomical detail. We do see, though, in the Carolingian style, something that's very different from that of the art of the Hiberno-Saxons. You do see in some works more of an emphasis on trying to create a reference to that Constantinian style. So even though the drapery is not perfectly believable, you can see an attention here truly to highlight and shadow, to making this foot seem recessed and this leg seem to come forward in this image of St. John from the Gospel book of Charlemagne. This is known as the Coronation Gospels. So these were literally the Gospel books for the emperor, and you can see here the emphasis on trying to kind of revive the ideas of the art of the Roman Empire. Certainly that is very evident in this window for the test. St. Matthew, also from the Gospel book of Charlemagne, from the Coronation Gospels, you can see that to some extent the way that highlight and shadow plays over this drapery is a little bit more believable than what we saw earlier, and it's a little more believable, really a lot more believable than what we saw in Hiberno-Saxon imagery. There's more of an emphasis on the believability of space, but with a grain of salt. I mean, there's no way that he could be writing on this table. The way that it's tilted is to show us the text and to show us St. Matthew involved in working on his book of the Gospels. From a later Gospel book, the Ebo Gospels, we have another image of Matthew, and it's a shocking contrast. It's the same model. It's the same big setup and composition. If I flip back and forth between them, you can really see it is the same basic setup. But notice here that although we do still have a lot of highlight on the leg and a lot of shadow, there is still some attempt to give us that dimensional Roman style that was so much the goal of Charlemagne's art campaigns. But we definitely have less believability in anatomy and far less believability here in terms of perspective. This table is almost completely tilted toward the viewer, which would make it impossible for Matthew really to be writing. The footstool, or whatever this lower section of his stool is completely illogical in terms of linear perspective. But what we've gained is this incredible fluidity of line. It almost feels like he is in frantic motion to get these words written down as quickly as possible. The drapery around him feels as if it's kind of tensely flowing over his body, as if it's being whipped by wind. It's a very, very different image than we have here just a few years earlier in the Coronation Gospels. So this is a book dedicated to Charles the Bald. This is the frontispiece, the beginning of the Gospel books, and we see Christ in majesty surrounded by the four evangels. And you can certainly see that there's a little bit more of an emphasis on the patterning or dividing of the scenes into individual sections here, as opposed to a single visual image that we saw with the images of Matthew writing the Gospels. We do still see the Gospel beasts. You can see the eagle, the lion, ducks, and the angelic man included there. These are also pretty remarkable illustrations. This is a Psalter, a book of the Psalms. This is the Utrecht Psalter, which really does show this fluidity of line that we started to see here in the Carolingian style, still continuing, but also an emphasis on trying to give us some sense of three-dimensional depth. The perspective, of course, is not perfect, but it does start to feel as though we are seeing bands of illustration that create a sense of movement of the story, of the scene of these psalms. It's also kind of interesting to pick apart an individual psalm from the Utrecht Psalter and see it being reproduced by later artisans. So the Utrecht Psalter was finished about the year 830, and the examples that you see to the lower part of the right-hand side of your screen are from around the year 1000, the year 1100. So these are actually English copies of this section of the Utrecht Psalter. And in fact, they are very faithful copies in terms of the text, which is presented in 3 vertical sections. So there are 3 translations. There's a Latin, there's a Gaelic. We also have additions in this later one. The Ottonian Psalter also has Old English translations included as well, making it a pretty remarkable text in its own right. But you can see, if we zoom in on this section here of the illustration, which includes Christ returning in the day of judgment and lifting the souls from their tombs, specifically Adam and Eve are depicted here. If we zoom in on that section, in the original Utrecht Psalter, you can see that Carolingian fluidity of line. It almost looks like a gestural sketch. You can see that begins to get lost in later translations. In the Harley Psalter from the year 1000, and from around 1100, the Ottonian Psalter has all the same elements. Even the 3 female figures are here. The figure with the cup is here, Christ with Adam and Eve, but the movement is entirely gone. That sense of fluidity and the sense of dynamic use of space and movement in space is utterly removed. One of the objects made probably for Charlemagne's heir, his grandson Charles the Bald, is the Lindau Gospel book. And in this case, we're looking at the cover. So we talked before about the pages inside of the illuminated manuscripts being made of vellum, of calfskin, and we looked mostly at the illustrations, but we alluded to, as far back as the Lindisfarne Gospels, we alluded to the importance of the cover. And so this gives you a good glimpse of what one of the covers would look like. This is a technique you're familiar with by this point, repoussé. So the image is worked from the back to raise an image in relief on the front, and we see the crucifixion. Again, not really emphasizing the cross, although you can see the nails and you can see some blood. But the figure of the body is more smoothed out. It's a little bit less linear than some of the images that we've seen in other styles. You see angels in mourning kind of surrounding the cross, and even human mourners here on the ground surrounding the figure. Pretty remarkable relief work, for one, but also incredible amount of work with precious stones and jewels. There are, in fact, 12 pearls included in the image, so probably a reference to the apostles in terms of the symbology of some of the stonework. It's rather remarkable. We also have architecture that we can ascribe to Charlemagne's reign, and you can certainly see that he is aware of the cultures around him. So Charlemagne, remember, rules what is essentially France, Germany, portions even of Italy. So he is well aware of the style of architecture that is throughout Spain as a result of the Islamic occupation. So he's aware of the architecture. Certainly, you can see it in the alternating color and in the double columns that are being used here. He's very much aware of the Great Mosque, or the Mezquita, in Cordoba, Spain. He's also well aware of that Eastern style of the central plan, and so his chapel, this is in fact where he was buried, the Palace Chapel of Charlemagne, is very much this fusion of the influence of some Islamic style, of the Eastern Byzantine style, into Charlemagne's own kind of Carolingian style as well. This brings us then to Carolingian chapels. A very prominent feature of these style of chapels, elaborate front facade, sometimes referred to as the westwork. The west end of the church is the entrance end, and the opposite end, the eastern end, is where the altar would be. So the westwork in Carolingian churches almost always involves these really enormous towers. It almost looks like a castle more than like a church. So this is the Abbey Church of Corvey. The Carolingian plan here for an ideal monastery gives you again a sense of the need for towers to mark space. We sometimes have towers at the front and at the back, and this is an overall reconstruction of the original design. So you can see the importance of having the Abbey Church with a cloister, an area that is usually open to the sky in the center but has a column around, and essentially an ambulatory type area. The locations of all of these important buildings and what their function should be is very much part of this new approach to Christianity, in which it's primarily the lifestyle of the monks and the nuns, and focusing their lives on celibacy and on what the prayers should be at every point of the day, and what their activities should be at every point of the day. So truly, the Abbey churches and the complex buildings surrounding them shows the emphasis on work, on productivity, and on education. You can see that there's spaces for guests and spaces for education. Also, the emphasis on the preservation of knowledge extends into having infirmaries and physicians' quarters, so that the practice of medicine is also deeply tied to the preservation of church belief as well. So the structure of these churches, these new Christian buildings in the Western European tradition, is very much based on the basilica form from ancient Rome. We're going to see, though, that over time these are going to become more and more elaborate. We'll see that in the Romanesque style and in the Gothic style a bit later, this unit. So when we're breaking the churches down and trying to analyze their structure, we need to have some vocab in common. So one element that's important to notice in a church is what we call the nave elevation. Now you remember, of course, the nave is that big central aisle where you can imagine the pews being, where you would sit facing toward the altar. So if you turn your attention not from the altar but to the side, to the wall that separates the nave from the side aisle, and here you see somebody walking in the side aisle, the nave elevation is the division of that wall into sections. So we have the nave arcade, that's the arches and columns that separate the nave from the side aisle. Above that level, you may have what we call the gallery, which is usually a second-story area where people can walk, and it is an open arcade that you can lean over and look down into the nave. A decorative repetition of that design here in what is known as the Triforium, and then the area where the windows are is known as the clerestory, sometimes pronounced clerestory. So the Triforium is an element that does not find its way into every style of church, and in fact the gallery is not included in all designs either, but we want to know these elements so you can really help to tell the churches apart one from the other. The vaulting is also pretty important. We are familiar with the barrel vault. That's that essentially long hallway with a rounded ceiling, or a barrel vault. We certainly have seen the Romans use the barrel vault quite frequently, and we also saw in some basilica forms what happens when two barrel vaults intersect creates what we call a groin vault, which creates essentially for support by dividing the weight of those two elements into these four piers. So it not only carries weight in a more efficient way, it also allows us to open the space up more to insert more windows. So you can see the groin vaulting that's happening right here as two barrels essentially intersect, and you can really see that that crossing has been emphasized with the addition of this stonework here. So the groin vault can be divided into these simple 4 units or more. You may find on occasion even more windows inserted by creating more intersections of vaults to create what we call in this a 6-part vault. 1 unit, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So a 6-part vault or a sexpartite, a 4-part vault or a quadripartite, we'll see are the primary forms we'll be looking at. So again, remember that all of this architecture does sort of have its roots as far back as what we studied in Unit 2 with the post and lintel style of the peripteral temple of ancient Greece. So essentially a rectangular building with its main entrances on the short sides, ringed with columns. The Romans, of course, altered this plan somewhat. It still divides into outer aisles and a wider interior space, but those columns have been moved to the inside of the building. The entrances, though, have been moved from the short sides to the long sides, allowing for the addition of these rounded areas known as the apses. So the Christian architects, as Christianity becomes acceptable in the Roman Empire, just adapt the basilica form. They're going to take one of the apses away, make that the entrance, focusing on the altar, still giving us a nave with side aisles, but they'll add one other feature, the crossing aisle, or the transept, and we'll see that quite frequently throughout the architecture of the Western Middle Ages. So the Ottonian style of cathedral building is somewhat similar. It builds on to the style of the Carolingian, so it's based on that Carolingian style. So again, these are the heirs of Charlemagne, like the second major phase of the Holy Roman Empire. This is the Ottonian Nunnery Church. This is a really kind of interesting church in that we see that the height of the building here is covered by a flat ceiling or a flat interior space. We're going to see more vaulting as we move into Western Europe. Definitely you can see that the churches themselves are operating in a slightly different way. The Ottonian churches quite frequently will have their entrances now on the long side and have apses on either end. So they do look a little bit more like a traditional Roman basilica. And that's certainly true of this Ottonian style church in Germany. This is St. Michael's from Hildesheim, and it's one that we do want to know for the test. It is remarkable in how many towers that it has. It definitely is imposing and castle-like in its appearance, but it's also important for us to recognize that it is very different in its structure in terms of where the entrance locations are. The entrances, again, are on our long sides, and those entrances are marked really with pretty remarkable artwork. Probably the most prominent and most important of the doors are these bronze relief doors. They are some of the most remarkable pieces of artwork that we can look at both in architecture and in developing the history of architecture and its relationship to sculpture. So we know that this particular church was commissioned by Bishop Bernward. And Bernward had gone on a pilgrimage to Rome. And while he was in Rome, he saw the Church of Santa Sabina, which has carved wooden doors, which I've reproduced a bit of them for you here. And he brought that idea back, and he wanted to create something similar for this new church he was commissioning for St. Michael's. And so St. Michael's Church has images made in relief similar to the Church of Santa Sabina, but instead of carved in wood, these were made in clay or wax. Molds were made, and then they were cast in bronze. So they are really remarkable accomplishments in terms of technology and in terms of artistic expression. They also tell important stories for us. In beginning here in Genesis, this is the creation of Eve, life in the Garden of Eden, the temptation and the fall of Adam and Eve. So this all brings us down to the children of Eve, a rather remarkable depiction of Cain murdering Abel at the bottom. And then the story continues on the opposite door and goes upward. It begins with the Annunciation, the announcement to Mary that she's pregnant with the Christ child, the birth of Christ, the nativity scene, veneration of the Magi, presentation of Jesus in the temple, then the story of the Passion of Christ leading us through the crucifixion and the resurrection. So here you see him resurrected at the top of the second door. This gives us a close-up of God condemning Adam and Eve in the garden. You can see the serpent, which actually has legs almost like a dragon. And you see that the form of the tree that they've eaten from, the tree of knowledge, almost begins to mimic the form of a cross. It has three main elements, the main branch and two side branches. You can also see the high degree of relief. The figures do cast shadows in some places because they extend pretty far from the background. Fairly low relief in the details of the garden itself behind them, but you also see that the representation of the anatomy is far less accurate. The heads are too large. The faces are a little bit repetitious, even between male and female. They look pretty much like the same head. You can see that this very much looks like some of the work that we saw in the decline of the Western style of the Roman Empire. I just wanted to jump us forward to the Ottonian style in terms of the work in the Scriptoria, in terms of the illuminated manuscripts. And so you start to see that the emphasis here is really somewhat more Byzantine. It's really more about symbolic representations of figures, a lot of gold leaf. The anatomy is highly inaccurate, and the drapery doesn't really flow realistically over the bodies the way that it did in the Carolingian. So we're really setting the stage for the kind of symbolic visual language that we'll see in the rest of the art of the Middle Ages. This is the cover and a page from the Youth Codex. Her name is sometimes spelled with a D, Uda or Utha. This is one of the few examples I can give you of how some women did in the Middle Ages rise to positions of power and of influence. One of the few names that has come down to us in history of a female abbess running her own nunnery. So this would be a book that would have been made not for the court, but for the use of the people that she's responsible for. So you can see kind of an emphasis on the Holy Mother and Child, and her importance to the nuns is pretty clear. The Ottonian style, though, very much in illustration does tend to divide images into small sections, even a bit more than we've seen in earlier works, and we also see a lot more emphasis on gold. We certainly see that here in Otto's successor, Henry II. He's the last of the Ottonian emperors, kings. We see this use of intense gold leaf happening here in his page, The Annunciation to the Shepherds. This is from the lectionary of Henry II. So this is a book that would have been used really for church services, but dedicated to the ruler. And you can see the gold leaf is very much like the style that we saw in the late Eastern style, the Byzantine. You can see that even in the figures of the sheep that the shepherds are protecting. You can see that in the repetition of the form of the hills. It feels kind of like the design style that we saw in the mosaics of Justinian and Theodora, or even the later Eastern Orthodox fresco painting style. So again, the idea of making these images readable and recognizable on a symbolic level, far more important than accuracy in anatomy. We do see, though, that some of the later work begins to have some reference to physical reality in terms of gravity at the very least, probably the most famous example being the Garo crucifix, which really does seem to show some attention to the stretch and physical weight of the body here in the chest, in the stomach, and in the movement in the legs. This is far more realistic in the respect of the body's response to gravity than what we saw in the Lindasval cover book. It is not 100% consistent across the artwork of the Ottonian era, however. You can see that a lot of the work still has these distorted proportions and kind of cartoon-esque elements.